Welcome to the Zoffee for June 1st, 2020. Today we're going to be talking to Marla Orenstein and Patrick Smith from the Canada West Foundation. We interviewed them last week about a briefing memo that they had put out around GHG emissions and the COVID-19 pandemic, and I thought it warranted a little more discussion that we were able to give it in the 10 minutes we did during the interview. So welcome to the Zoffee, Marla and Patrick.
Thanks so much.
Now, why don't we start with a brief overview of the briefing memo?
Sure. So Patrick and I were really intrigued because the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is the global organization that does the best job in collecting energy statistics, reporting on energy use, and making predictions about the future, said that they were going to be taking a look at what had happened to the first quarter of 2020 in terms of energy demand. So the first quarter being January the 1st to March the 31st. So it's before the height of the lockdowns. It's before the height of COVID, but that was still well eating into our energy use by that point. So we're really intrigued to see what came out of that. So they put out a nice fat report that Patrick and I were able to go through and take a look at the data and take a look at what some of the implications are for Canada as we best understood them. What they found is that in that first quarter, overall energy use declined, and Patrick, please jump in if I get these numbers right. Overall energy use declined about 4%, which may not seem much, but it's actually the largest single decrease since the end of the Second World War. It's quite dramatic when you look at the graphs and see how much it's plunged. They were also able to take a look a little more finely during the lockdowns themselves at places that were being locked down, either totally or partially, and looking on, instead of the full quarter, looking on just a weekly basis under the strongest conditions of the lockdowns. What they found are those places that had full lockdown, energy use dropped by about 25%. Under those places with a partial lockdown, it dropped by about 18%. A lot of this driven by a decrease in transportation because nobody could go anywhere, at least on a personal level. Air transport, as you know, just plummeted right down. Road transport plummeted right down. Electricity dropped somewhat, but a lot of it just shifted locations from workplaces to houses. What we did find is that the energy sources that weren't affected evenly, coal was something that got pushed out relatively quickly. Part of this is because it was still tied with a lot of industrial processes. The industries had to shut down, so the coal use was down. Coal is also used to fire electricity power plants, so it dropped there. Oil and gas also decreased somewhat, but not quite as much as coal. And interestingly, the renewables were basically untouched in terms of demand. And part of this is because they were given preferential access. So electricity dispatch preferentially first went for renewables, sometimes for cost and sometimes out of a sort of an ethical or moral stance that the government had taken. And part of it is because we don't actually have that much renewables in the mix, so their full capacity could still be used and then a whole bunch. So we saw that the heavier GHG emitting fuels being pushed out a little bit first. And so they also took a look at GHG emissions during that period. So we had overall a 4% decline in energy use and about a 5% decline in GHG emissions in that first quarter. They hadn't yet published, or haven't yet published as far as I know, what happened during the peak of the lockdown. So what were the GHG emissions that were associated with those 25% and 18% drops in energy use? But we can assume it's probably close to, or maybe a little bit higher than 25% or 18% in total.
Now, what are the conclusions that you draw from that information? Because frankly, Marla, there's nothing in there that's particularly startling to me. I mean, my takeaway is that there's a lot of energy use that even when we stop going to work, continues because you're using energy at home and you're maybe driving less, but you're not driving that much less. And so none of this is, I find, particularly surprising anyway. But what are the conclusions that you drew from that data?
Well, one of them is the very stark question of, are we going to be able to meet our Paris targets? We all know that GHG decreases are a priority. This is a terrible way to go about it. Nobody wants to have a future that means just staying at home, not going into work, having businesses shuttered, not being able to travel. It's a terrible approach for it. But even with that degree of lockdown, we're still not able to get to where our targets are. So we're going to need huge systemic change. If we can't make that change happen at a systems level, I don't think we have a chance of getting to actually meeting what those targets are.
Great. Now, again, I would agree with you. I mean, that's the one of the points that I made in my book last year was that the global energy system is changing. And you referenced Professor Vaclav Smil in your briefing memo, who's the preeminent scholar on energy transitions, and his point, which annoys many renewable energy advocates, is that energy systems change really, really slowly. They're really complex, they're big, and it doesn't happen in a hurry, and so we should think of it in terms of evolution, not revolution. All fair comment. But nevertheless, the system is changing, and it is slowly switching from fossil fuel use, high GHG intense fuels like coal, to lower GHG intense fuels like electricity generated by wind and solar. All of that's fine. So is your point that needs to happen a lot quicker if we're going to meet the Paris targets?
Absolutely. It would have to happen much, much quicker. And we also have to be pretty cautious about how we go forward, because in all systems, when you're trying to, if you have a laser focus on eliminating a certain problem, you're still dragging in other problems through the back door at the same time. There is no energy source on this planet that is consequence-free. So it's really a question of pick your poison in some ways and try to have as little of it as possible.
What's the poison associated with renewables, particularly wind and solar?
Well, I'm going to talk about hydro first, because hydro is actually one of our major sources of renewables right now. We're living off the clean energy that a lot of hydro infrastructure that was developed in the 1950s is able to give us. But at the time, and in the subsequent decades, there is still a lot of pushback around the creation of large hydroelectric facilities, because there's huge land disturbance. It creates enormous change in ecosystems upstream and downstream. Communities often have to be moved. Ways of life are changed. As I said, aquatic ecosystems are changed. You dam things and suddenly methyl mercury comes out of the ground and you have that mercury exposure. It's not a clean process. And, I think Quebec, for example, is in a fortunate position, or Newfoundland, that a lot of that has happened already, and they can continue living off the bounty, so to speak, of what changes occurred in decades where there was much less of a focus on consultation, on adverse effects and whatnot. But if we put in new hydro, then all those problems come right back again. So it's not the same for necessarily run of river, et cetera. But for large hydro projects, we're engendering those same problems. And this is happening right now all over the world.
Well, this raises an issue that I bang on all the time in my columns, and in particular directed towards the Alberta oil and gas industry, which is the extent to which the political and policy climate in which development takes place, how that's changed over the last 10 or 20 years. You mentioned more consultation. Well, in Canada, we have Section 35 of the Constitution. We have obligations to consult Aboriginal people, and then that has legal consequences when they request judicial reviews in the federal courts. I mean, we can't get away from that, and it slows things down, and that's just the price of development. It's part of, it's a feature, not a bug, is a point I try to make all the time. And so things have to go slower. We have to be more cautious. We have to take into account things that we didn't during the 1950s, when we just, were popping up dams all over the place. I don't mean to be flip when I say this, but so what?
Can you tell me more what you mean by the so what?
Yeah.
Well, but this is all this, to me, the takeaway from what you just said is that we just have to do we have to do it more, we have to do it better, we have to be more efficient at it, but we still have to do it, and we have to do a lot more of it.
We do, and we have to do a lot more, and we have to do it sensibly as well. I think your point is well taken, and it also injects a note of reality. Much that we really may like solar and wind in many, for many cases, and it's not, again, they're not consequence free, and we can get back to that. Where we generate them is not where we always use them. And so we need to build transmission systems that can move them from the places where they're generated to where they're consumed. And that itself is very controversial. We had the Manitoba-Minnesota transmission line. The hearings happened just a few years ago. These things don't happen instantly. They're not quick, and they're not easy either. So simply saying, that's it, oil's over, build more renewables, that's our solution, is ignoring the reality of what we need to do.
Well, fair enough, but I would argue that's a false dichotomy, because very few people in this country actually argue that oil should be done and the well shut off tomorrow. There's a very small, if you look at Abacus data polling, for instance, it shows that about 20% of Canadians don't like oil and gas and don't like pipelines, but that percentage never changes. And then on the other end, there's 15% of Canadians who are ardent oil and gas pipeline supporters, and then there's a bunch in the middle. And the problem for the industry is that some of the supporters have been migrating into the neutral category, and I think that's indicative of where energy politics is going as a rule, as people are kind of moving over towards it. But it isn't a wholesale change yet. Anyway, so let's talk about renewables. And so, what are some of the poison, I think is what you call it? What are the poisons attached with wind and solar?
Well, one of the, again, for this and all energy types, it depends on how you do it. But one of the big problems that comes with wind and solar in large scale is land take. They take up a massive land footprint. I think it was David Keith who had estimated at one point that if you wanted to get enough wind power for current energy use worldwide right now, you'd have to cover 80% of the land mass with wind turbines. It's a huge amount. And so obviously we're keeping it we're not letting it take over 80%, but any place that you have it, you're putting it into a new system, you're changing how the land is used. One of the big problems with that is that we've got another crisis coming up right behind the emissions crisis and the climate crisis here, and it's a crisis in biodiversity. We are losing biodiversity at an incredibly rapid rate, and it's something that we really need to be keeping our eye on. So we can't just have the focus on what's going to be good for emissions if the problem of biodiversity is one that we are increasing as a result. So that is one problem that comes with large-scale solar or wind. Another has to do with the materials that are required for creating those projects. And those require a lot of metals and a lot of minerals that are mined very often in circumstances that have enormous, not just environmental, but also social consequences in how that's being done. So the how can get better, but we have to recognize that it isn't better yet as well.
All of that is fair game. I mean, these issues are very complex, and there are always lots of problems to solve during significant systemic change and the kind of structural change that we're seeing in markets. So I wouldn't agree or disagree with any of that. The concern I had when I was reading your piece, Marla and Patrick, is that it kind of feeds into the narrative in Alberta of industry leaders who say, well, it's such a big problem, and these guys over here, the Chinese are still building, coal-fired power plants, and they're not doing enough, and the Indians are still not doing enough, and so why should we do more? Why should we, reduce emissions in the oil sands and take that penalty that nobody else is willing to incur? How do you respond to that take on it?
But I can empathize with that point of view and where it comes from. Both the largeness of the goal seem so frustrating, as well as it's true that those who are going to step forward first to clean things up will incur a sort of penalty, and there are those who don't want to pay it. But at the same time, I think this is a place where Canada has an opportunity to lead, and this is another briefing note that Patrick and I have stuck in our back pockets right now. Is we may only be 2% of the emissions, but can we be more than 2% of the solution in terms of cleaning this up? And again, specifically looking at oil and gas, I think that there are things that we can do. Once we create technologies, we have the ability to export them to other places where it can be used. I think back to the problem of sulfur emissions, which was an enormous problem, and a huge solution that became a billion-dollar industry came out of Alberta, where they figured out, because regulations said you can't be emitting all this sulfur, they figured out early how to fix it, how to clean it up. And then an industry blossomed in which they were able to take those solutions and apply them to the rest of the world, which were being a little bit laggards in terms of cleaning up the sulfur. So to the extent that we can figure out how to really decarbonize industrial processes, whether it's energy generation from oil or other things, can this be something that we then turn to our advantage in some way? That is one of several different ways I would say that we can have an outsized footprint on what we're doing.
And then just to add on to that quickly, if one group or the other was to take that as, oh, you know, drill, baby, drill, that's how we're going to get there. Other folks in the climate diplomacy internationally aren't going to be honoring their respective commitments. That would be misrepresenting the message I think we were trying to send with this brief. It's where it's going to be a host of energy sources that are going to be required, and all of them will be required to help decarbonize and reduce emissions globally.
Yeah, sure, and that's fair enough, and I think, you know, from the IEA on down, that's a commonly held view, and it's certainly one that I don't have a problem with. But I have this not fixation, but a real concern about what's going on in Alberta, because Canada's GHG emission goals go right through Alberta. Alberta is 26% of national emissions. The oil sands are 11% of national emissions. There is no way Canada gets even close to its targets without cooperation from Alberta. And what I hear over and over and over again from the leadership is a pushback on emissions reduction because of the costs and regulatory requirements. But here's the thing that I made this point in the book, and it's something I still don't understand. So the oil sands, I interviewed Suncor and Cenovus and CNRL and other companies, and they said, one of the reasons why we want to decarbonize our production is because we think that in Asia, which is market we want to get into, you know, Trans Mountain expansion being part of the solution there, is that we think that they're going to introduce really strict carbon pricing and other climate policies over the next 5 to 10 years. So if we reduce the emissions intensity per barrel, that gives us a competitive advantage over countries like Saudi Arabia heavy and Iran heavy, and, you know, Mexico and Venezuela and countries like that. So they actually not only see this as a risk mitigation issue, they see it as a competitive advantage issue. It's an opportunity. But the problem is that in the narrative, in the discussion focuses on the risk and the cost, and rarely do we talk about the opportunity. So for me, when I look at your piece, I see it in narrative terms, and that was where I, you know, had a little concern on that. But sounds like you're going maybe to address that.
I hope so, and I agree with you about it's not necessarily getting out there in terms of what some companies want to do to transition and why they have a competitive advantage. We've seen a number of companies, an increasing number of companies, come out with pledges for net zero. Cenovus has come out, I think CNRL has come out, at least several of them so far. They don't necessarily have a very strong plan for how they're going to get there yet. And I think part of it is that they're really going to have to all pull together in order to do that, along with actors who are outside of the oil sector. But to me, it's indicative of the intention of at least some of them and the leadership that's starting to come up from within the industry. I agree that it appears to be a disconnect right now between the desires and narrative of the provincial government right now and where some of the industry is wanting to go. And also there's not homogeneity within the industry itself. Oil producers are all over the place in terms of both what they want and their ability to move the needle.
Last comment from me, and then we'll get into some questions after your answer. But again, in the Energy Declaration, other work that I've done, I make the point that if we want to address the issue of climate change, which is the issue of reducing GHG emissions, we don't focus on climate change, because the energy transition is the answer, is the solution to climate change, and we're already 20 years into the energy transition. And what we should be doing is putting more emphasis on the energy transition, and I think of that as the bus. and and climate policy as the accelerator pedal. So all the trends that you have already, the switch to, the growth of renewable energy, the growth of electrification of transportation, all that stuff, you can make it go faster with policy, but every time you do that, you have to accept that there's more risk and cost. So how much risk and cost are you willing to accept as you press the pedal harder? And I think that's to me, that is a useful way of framing the discussion, because then a Canadian can look at that and go, well, I'm willing to take X amount of risk. Maybe I'm a big risk taker, or maybe I'm sort of in the middle, or maybe I'm very conservative. I don't want any risk at all, or minimal amount of risk. But we can put the risk issue on the table and then decide what kind of policies we can design that is compatible with the amount of risk we're willing to take. So we were talking about impact assessment, which is a risk management issue. Marla, what's your take on that?
Well, impact assessment is an important practice. It's something that helps align how a project is going to go forward with making sure that adverse consequences aren't unmitigatable or too large, and that you remember to bring the benefits with you. I know that in Canada we've been pushing together the discussion of both how and should we. And that's what the whole bun fight over C69 was about. Is it wasn't so much about the how do we make projects work well, as much as how do we decide on whether a project should be approved or not. One of the things that we do in the Canada West Foundation is our bread and butter is looking at policies and regulations to try to understand and unpack what are they going to do, because very often there's a large gap between the intention of the policy or regulation, which is very often something that we would want to support, and the measures that are being put in place to implement that outcome. And those often fall short. And what we certainly don't want to have happen is people tripping over the implementation details in order to actually get the outcome.
Oh, we've lost Marla, unfortunately. Sometimes this happens. Zoom will drop a feed because of an internet connection issue. I'm sure she'll be back momentarily. So Patrick, I'm afraid you're going to have to, it's all on your shoulders now. So anyway, we're getting the point that Marla was saying, that the impact assessment is about mitigating these things, and to me that talks about, well, what are the risks? What are the risks we're not going to achieve our policy goals, or we'll have unintended consequences as a result of those policies. So I want to get back though to my original point, is our appetite for risk. So give me your take on that.
I actually think that this brief kind of acts complementary, or tries to illustrate what some of those, maybe not risks, but costs and benefits are the magnitude of cutting emissions and what that actually requires globally. In the brief, we talked about how Paris requires a 25 to 55% cut depending on a 1.5 to 2 degree scenario. And as Marla mentioned earlier, with flight travel down 90% in some countries, road travel down 50 to 75%, we're only on track for about 8% if the lockdowns were to continue throughout the year. And so to put that in perspective, and if we're trying to talk about benefits, costs, and risks to the energy transition, one thing that's important to consider is that a 1.5 degree future, you would need 8% reduction in emissions per year until 2030. And then for a 2 degree future, it's roughly a 2.6% drop per year until 2030. So I actually think that this brief works complementary to the strategy you had referenced, and it helps kind of give folks a sense of context when we're talking about reducing emissions and the energy transition.
Well, fair enough. Let's get some questions now from our folks who are attending. If you have a question for Marla or Patrick, please put up your hand. So Dave has got his hand up, and Dave, unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
I thought your brief was brilliant. It's one of the best things I've seen in a long time. I mean, I'm into energy density, power density numbers, watts meter squared and all that. But the average person just doesn't follow the math and get it. I just thought it was really good. Not just because you referenced Mill, who I'm a big fan of actually, but just wondering about the concept of backward engineering things, looking at when early 60s, we had 3.5 billion people, 7 gigatons of greenhouse gases going off. Now we've doubled that population, but gone up 7 times, 6 times. Is there any way to backward engineer? I grew up in the 60s, so did Brian, and I mean, it was great place to be. Food was fresher. There weren't, those little plasticky things that hold everything. How do we get away? It was just ridiculous. Clamshell casing didn't exist. One of the banes of my life now. So no, I just thought it was a brilliant piece, and thanks a lot for doing it.
Thanks so much. It's a really interesting question. I like the concept of backward engineering. What comes to my mind, though, is the problem that we get hung up on is not the technical can we get there, because I think we can. It's that we don't have the benevolent dictatorship in place to be able to impose this on everybody. And there's so many different values and opinions that people have. I think that's truly the stumbling point on all this. I mean, part of it is if you have sufficient charismatic leadership, that can bring people a long way. And if you have a really good vision and plan that people can hook into, that can bring people a long way. And technology can go a long way. But you have this many-headed hydra at all times pulling in all these different directions. And so it becomes the enemy.
Marla has lost her connection again, but I want to address the question she raised, which is that we have the technology, we have the technical capability of meeting these emissions requirements. What we lack is leadership, and we lack vision. And I think that's particularly true in Canada. I look at both the provincial governments across the country, even the federal government. So, Justin Trudeau in Alberta, for instance, is vilified for being this, green ideologue. And yet I find that his green message, his leadership on these is very temperate. It's almost not enough of a requirement. And I guess maybe that's the nature of the decentralized confederation we live in. But nevertheless, I wrote the Energy Declaration and the hydrocarbon vision to, contribute to that conversation and try to provide some of those new ideas. And I find there's just not enough of that in this country. So I agree with Marla on that point. And Patrick, why don't we get your take on that argument?
I think I would agree with everything the both of you just said, and just add, we've also lacked this speed. It was in the early 1990s when the IPCC was created. We've had a slew of different international agreements, whether it's Kyoto, Paris, and it just seems to be kicked down the road, whether it's administrations in the States or abroad, and different groups in Canada as well. So not only is it the benevolent dictator that Marla was referencing, I think there's also a lack of urgency that is present as well.
Yeah, fair enough. So Brian Heidecker, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Well, that Patrick's comment leads right into my question. Just to be the devil's advocate, and accustomed as I am to doing that, but we can agree, and I think bulk of Canadians agree that yes, we need to do something. We vary a little bit on how and when, but the thing that always comes back to haunt us is, okay, why is Canada going to do this when nobody else in the world is going to do it? Nobody else is going to meet their standards. China does this, India, they're the two big boogeymen, but Europeans aren't exactly saints on meeting their targets either. So how do we address that particular point of view and that? Because most of us are willing to do something as long as we know the other folks are doing as much.
Marla,
it's a great question. I am, and I apologize for dropping out. I don't know what's happening, and I'm disappointed because these questions are the juiciest part of the whole thing. You know, Brian, I've heard this from other people as well, and it's a really, really good question. I think it helps somewhat if we can get away from the idea of targets, and you're going to meet your target, and you're not going to meet your target. And if we recognize this as being a shared necessity that we all need to contribute to in some way, maybe it helps. I think is this question of, I know Patrick will have some things to say on this as well, but even getting agreement on the outcome of we want to limit emissions globally is tricky enough. And then putting in place a system of how we're going to measure, how we're going to account for this, and specific targets that we all have to meet, that is, even if you subscribe to the goal of it, that's a really difficult one, because I mean, that's an accounting fiction in many ways. And we live under these things all the time. Urban form is an accounting fiction. Tax systems, tax codes are an accounting fiction. Fundamentally, you need to give the government some money, but how are you going to account? How do you get it fair between this person and the next person? I'm not answering the question, but I recognize the complexity of that one. Patrick, do you have some comments?
I'll try to avoid answering it as well, if I may. But this is part of a broader piece. I think Marla was referencing earlier about how we were trying to find a way to leverage Canada's 2%, and there's no simple answer to it. And the point you brought up is totally true. It's part of the reason why some stuff like Kyoto, some agreements in the past, Kyoto, weren't as successful. When you have developing nations not part of a deal, and you have developed nations part of emissions targets. And I think what Marla said is key. It's got to be, the focus has to be reducing emissions. And if we can do that across borders, and whether that's with a national target or international targets, or with sector-wide phase-outs or sector-wide more targeted emissions reductions, I think there are ways to do it. It just remains to be seen how we get there.
Well, look, I want to jump in here, because I kind of disagree with the two of you in that the sense I believe that there's plenty of leadership. Leadership doesn't, leap out of the genie bottle fully formed. It evolves over time, and I think that the leadership on this particular issue is much stronger today than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Going back to Kyoto '93. But that all said, so why should Canada be a leader instead of a laggard? Why shouldn't we just live off other people? Well, one of the reasons is because there are opportunities to be seized. I mean, take a look at what the electric vehicle industry and how China, Europe, in particular in Europe you have Germany, and the United States, in particular there we're talking about California and the big automakers, but how they've jumped on the electric vehicle bandwagon. They've gone out in the forefront of battery storage. They're out on the forefront of driving down costs on electric vehicle manufacturing. Canada has missed the boat on light duty car and truck EV manufacturing. We're going to get the crumbs, just like we did under the Auto Pact in '64. That's the best we can absolutely hope for. We're not going to lead anywhere on anything, but there's still the opportunity in commercial EVs. So I'm talking about delivery vans and forklifts and semi-trucks and all of those market niches. That opportunity still exists, and that opportunity is coming because of the energy transition. So it's not just all about, in fact, I think we should stop talking about, we should downplay this fear-based narrative around climate change, and we should be talking about the opportunities that we should seize by being a first mover. Now, did I have any audio while I was rambling on?
You just got it
not
back.
At the end.
Oh,
but it was brilliant.
It really was. I'm sure that my lips moving was highly entertaining. Well, look, I'll sum it up this way, because we'll edit this part out. The reason Canada should play a leadership role is because anytime there's structural change in markets and industries, there are many, many opportunities. We've already missed a bunch of them, and the electric vehicle industry would be the most obvious. We're not going to be leaders in the light duty cars and trucks, but we could be leaders in commercial vehicles, or at least in market niches. We could be leaders, we already are leaders in clean tech. We need to be the leader in clean tech. There's all kinds of things we can do that come with being a first mover in an industry rather than a laggard. And I think that we need to start emphasizing that narrative and downplaying this whole fear-based, well, we need to do something, but we can't do it any faster than, the guy over there because he's not being responsible. So anyway, that's my take on it. We've got some more questions. Dave Patterson, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Interesting topic. I guess I'm an optimist. I see the technological advances and the price improvements are the things that are going to save us, not doing the right thing. Now that, wind and solar, the price per megawatt is, at the price of fueled energy. You're seeing people just anywhere where the cost of energy is high or the cost or energy is imported, they're switching to renewables. Even in northern Alberta, I think Fort Chip is put in solar and batteries. They've cut their diesel use by 10%. So, and then there's the whole thing with fueled energy. Not only do you have your input fuel costs all the time, but you've got this never-ending little rat wheel where you're constantly having to dig and explore and drill more wells, dig more holes to main production. So I think the economics are it's going to be exponentially be just a driving force in a change.
Sure, fair enough, Dave. Okay, Marla, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I like this positive vision of the future, and I think there's a number of different areas where Canada has green pastures ahead. Clean tech is one. Hydrogen is another that David Lazelle and group have been working on out of the University of Calgary. It's a big gamble, but it's one that could pay off really well. We can be really world leaders in reclamation and remediation, in decarbonization of industrial systems. There's in water technologies is a huge one that I wouldn't forget about either. We're really good at managing and cleaning large volumes of water, something that's increasingly needed across the world. I think one of the challenges, though, is that the people for whom the green pastures are unfurling are not necessarily the same exact people who see their opportunity diminishing. And so on an individual basis, even as a country, we may have opportunities opening, but you're still going to see people wanting to fight for what it is that they have now if they perceive it to be taken away. And that's just human nature.
And I will, before we get to Dave, I want to respond to that because that's a big theme of my journalism. And that is that while there may be pushback, and you get a big part of that from the Alberta oil and gas industry because of exactly that reason, nevertheless, change is coming and you can't just wish it away. It has to be adapted. And if Alberta wants a hydrocarbon industry long-term, and I mean after 2050, if it wants after 2100, then it has to do things differently and has to begin pivoting now, not in 2030 or 2050. One of those things is moving from the focus on the fuels market to the focus on feedstock for materials production, like carbon fiber and polymers and things like that. So the pushback that you're talking about, Marla, then becomes an impediment to sound business decisions if you're looking at more of the medium to long term. I would argue. So, but we're going to take another question from Dave. So, Dave, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Just almost more of a comment. There's so many wild cards in this. A third of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions come from their military. I imagine China, Russia are not far behind. So there's a whole thing about world peace and militarization that will play a role in this because we're not going anywhere without world peace, I'm afraid. And I just to throw it out, not as a pediment to things, but there's so many different things we could be doing, educating girls in third world countries, all kinds of neat stuff from Project Drawdown, which I'm sure you're aware of. Yeah. But there's just a kind of a final comment from me that world peace is probably a really important thing in getting to where we need to go.
you want to eradicate child poverty and hunger while you're at it, Dave? Just put it on the
I
table.
can't bake that much bread every morning, Markham. It's not possible.
Marla, if you wouldn't mind responding, please.
I'm not sure that I have much to respond to, Dave. I agree with what you say, and you know, the SpaceX launch was yesterday, if you're following that at all, and I was looking at that and thinking both, wow, that's really neat, and wow, I wonder how much GHG emissions that costs. I haven't seen any statistics yet, but I'm kind of curious. And so to me, it gets at the problem of the very multiple goals that we have that we want to accomplish as human beings. Do we want to go into space? That's fantastic. What's it going to cost us in GHGs? These aren't easy solutions.
Brian Heidecker, you'll be the last question. So if I could call on you to unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Well, a bit of a comment perhaps, but you know, following on my other question, I mean, the solution and the option for this has to be market driven, and all of the technology, all of those sorts of things. I'm a very unpatriotic Albertan. I have been in favor of a carbon tax for a long time, also a sales tax, so I'm doubly unpatriotic. But until we put a price on this, and then people can start figuring the workarounds and how do we do these things, and that's how we're going to get it. And the last thing we need is cheap oil and gas. We cannot get these things done. We need high oil and gas prices for the alternatives to find their place and work themselves into the market. So I agree. And there's tons of opportunities coming if we would just get some simple public policies in place.
I couldn't agree more. Marla?
I like your ideas very much, Brian, both on the carbon tax and the sales tax. I have to say this, the energy drop that we saw in the IEA statistics had me really rethinking the carbon tax, though. My reason being, can it be enough? Because if all the standstill of transportation that we've had from the COVID lockdowns hasn't been enough to decrease it enough, I can't imagine what kind of carbon tax is going to be enough to decrease, let's say, transportation even below where we have it right now. A carbon tax is no good if it's just about taking money or shuffling money around. It has to change behavior, and it has to change it sufficiently for us to make that dent. So maybe it goes back to the issue of there's not just one solution. It's a many, you know, part of many things, but just a little bit of a tax, just enough that we're taking some pennies out of our pocket. It's not going to be enough. It's got to be a really meaningful tax that will drive behavioral change.
I would agree with you, though, on your point about how the market, if the market is able to make these choices, that is probably the best way forward, or one of the better ways forward. Marla and I had written a piece earlier in the year on how the US had a drop in emissions. And while it wasn't a carbon tax in that instance, renewables and cheap natural gas were actually beating out coal. And so they had the single largest drop in emissions for any one country on record. And so I agree. If there's some sort of price signal that can be sent to private participants in the market, that is likely to be one of the more effective ways at lowering emissions, both at a national and international level.
I'll close out the discussion by pointing to a couple of economists that I follow on Twitter who make the point that, in fact, carbon pricing alone isn't enough. And I think Mark Jakarta from Simon Fraser University is one of these. He calls for flex regs. So there are three policy levers that can be pulled. Carbon pricing is one of them. Regulations is the second. Subsidies are the third. And you see the federal governments and some of the provincial governments essentially taking this approach where there's a policy mix, and you can argue where you should put emphasis. And I think all the federal parties in particular have a different emphasis on those policy levers, but nevertheless, that's kind of what's at our disposal. So look, thank you very much for this, Marla and Patrick. Really appreciate it. We've only, skimmed the surface on this. There's a lot more discussion to be had, and we'll look forward to getting you back in the future to have more.
Thank you all very much. This is fantastic.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, folks. We'll see you at the next one on Wednesday.
Bye-bye.